Hello. Today I'm going to read for Sources for America's History, 8th edition, edited by Kevin Sheets and published by Bedford St. Martin's Press. This reading is 1907, Theodore Roosevelt's annual message to Congress. Conservation of our natural resources and their proper use constitute the fundamental problem which underlies almost every other problem of our national life. We must maintain for our civilization the adequate material basis without which that civilization cannot exist. We must show foresight. We must look ahead. As a nation, we not only enjoy a wonderful measure of present prosperity, but if this prosperity is used aright, it is an earnest of future success, such as no other nation will have. The reward of foresight for this nation is great and easily foretold, but there must be the look ahead. There must be a realization of the fact that to waste, to destroy our natural resources, to skin and exhaust the land instead of using it so as to increase its usefulness, will result in the undermining of the days of our children, and the very prosperity which we ought by right to hand down to them amplified and developed. Our great river system should be developed as national water highways, the Mississippi, with its tributaries, standing first in importance, and the Columbia second, although there are many others of importance on the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Gulf slopes. The national government should undertake this work, and I hope a beginning will be made in the present Congress. And the greatest of all of our rivers, the Mississippi, should receive special attention. From the Great Lakes to the mouth of the Mississippi, there should be a deep waterway, and deep waterways leading to it from the east and the west. Such a waterway will practically mean the extension of our coastline into the very heart of our country. It would be of incalculable benefit to our people. If begun at once, it can be carried through in time appreciably to relieve the congestion of our great freight-carrying lines of railways. Moreover, the development of our waterways involves many other important water problems, all of which should be considered as part of the same general scheme. The government dams should be used to produce hundreds of thousands of horsepower as an incident to improve navigation. For the annual value of unused water power in the United States perhaps exceeds the annual value of the products of all of our mines. Irrigation should be far more extensively developed than at present, not only in the states of the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains, but in many others, as for instance in large portions of the South Atlantic and Gulf states, where it should go hand in hand with the reclamation of swampland. The federal government should seriously devote itself to this task, realizing that utilization of waterways and water power, forestry, irrigation, and the reclamation of lands threatened with overflow are all interdependent parts of the same problem. The work of the Reclamation Service in developing the larger opportunities of the western half of our country for irrigation is more important than almost any other movement. The constant purpose of the government in connection with the Reclamation Service has been to use the water resources of the public lands for the ultimate greatest good of the greatest number. In other words, to put upon the land permanent homemakers, to use and develop it for themselves and for their children and children's children. There has been, of course, opposition to this work. Opposition from some interested men who desire to exhaust the land for their own immediate profit without regard for the welfare of the next generation. And opposition from honest and well-meaning men who did not fully understand the subject, or who did not look far enough ahead. This opposition is, I think, dying away, and our people are understanding that it would be utterly wrong to allow a few individuals to exhaust for their own temporary personal profit the resources which ought to be developed through use so as to be conserved for the permanent common advantage of the people as a whole. The effort of the government to deal with the public land has been based upon the same principle as that of the Reclamation Service. The land law system, which was designed to meet the needs of the fertile and well-watered regions of the Middle West, is largely broken down when applied to the drier regions of the Great Plains, mountains, and much of the Pacific slope, where a farm of 160 acres is inadequate for self-support. In these regions, the system lent itself to fraud, and much land passed out of the hands of government without passing into the hands of the homemaker. The Department of the Interior and the Department of Justice joined in prosecuting the offenders against this law, and they have accomplished much, while where the administration of the law has been defective, it has been changed. But the laws themselves are defective. 3 years ago, a Public Lands Commission was appointed to scrutinize the law and defects and recommend a remedy. Their examination specifically showed the existence of great fraud upon the public domain, and their recommendations for changes in the law were made with the design of conserving the natural resources of every part of the public lands by putting it to its best use. Some such legislation as that proposed is essential in order to preserve the great stretches of public grazing land which are unfit for cultivation in present methods, and are valuable only for the forage which they supply. These stretches amount in all to some 300 million acres, and are open to free grazing of cattle, sheep, horses, and goats without restriction. Such a system, or lack of system, means that the range is not so much used as wasted by abuse. As the West settles, the range becomes more and more overgrazed. Much of it cannot be used to advantage unless it is fenced, for fencing is the only way by which to keep in check the owners of nomad flocks which roam hither and thither, utterly destroying the pastures and leaving the waste behind, so that their presence is incompatible with the presence of homemakers. The existing fences are all illegal. Some of them represent improper exclusion of actual settlers, actual homemakers, from territory which is usurped by great cattle companies. Some of them represent what is in itself a proper effort to use the range for those upon the land and to prevent its use by nomadic outsiders. All these fences, those that are hurtful and those that are beneficial, are alike illegal and must come down. But it is an outrage that the law should necessitate such action on the part of the administration. The unlawful fencing of public lands for private grazing must be stopped, and the necessity which occasioned it must be provided for. The federal government should have control of the range, whether by permit or lease, as local necessities may determine. The destruction of the public range will continue until some laws are enacted. Optimism is a good characteristic, but if carried to an excess, it becomes foolishness. We are prone to speak of the resources of this country as inexhaustible. This is not so. The mineral wealth of the country, the coal, iron, oil, gas, and the like, does not reproduce itself, and therefore is certain to be exhausted ultimately. And wastefulness in dealing with it today means that our descendants will feel the exhaustion of a generation or two before they otherwise would. But there are certain other forms of waste which could be entirely stopped. The waste of soil by washing, for instance, which is among the most dangerous of all wastes now in progress in the United States, is easily preventable, so that this present enormous loss of fertility is entirely unnecessary. The preservation or replacement of the forests is one of the most important means of preventing the loss. We have made a beginning in forest preservation, but it's only a beginning. At present, lumbering is the fourth greatest industry in the United States, and yet so rapid has been the rate of exhaustion of timber in the United States in the past, and so rapidly is the remainder being exhausted, that the country is unquestionably on the verge of a timber famine, which will be felt in every household upon the land. There has already been a rise in the price of lumber. but there is certain to be a more rapid and heavier rise in the future. The present annual consumption of lumber is certainly 3 times as great as the annual growth. And if the consumption and growth continue unchanged, practically all our lumber will be exhausted in another generation. While long before the limit to complete exhaustion is reached, the growing scarcity will make itself felt in many blighting ways upon our national welfare. About 20% of our forested territory is now reserved in national forests, but these do not include the most valuable timberlands, and in any event, the proportion is too small to expect that the reserves can accomplish more than a mitigation of the trouble which is ahead for the nation. Far more drastic action is needed. Forests can be lumbered so as to give the public full use of their mercantile timber without the slightest detriment to the forest, any more than is detriment to a farm to furnish the harvest, so that there is no parallel between forests and mines, which can only be completely used by exhaustion. But forests, if used as all our forests have been used in the past, and as most of them are still being used, will either be wholly destroyed or so damaged that many decades have to pass before effective use can be made of them again. Every businessman in the land, every writer in the newspapers, every man or woman of an ordinary school education ought to be able to see that immense quantities of timber are used in the country, and that the forests which supply this timber are rapidly being exhausted, and that if no change takes place, exhaustion will come comparatively soon, and that the effects of it will be felt severely in everyday life of our people. Surely, when these facts are so obvious, there will be no delay in taking preventative measures. Yet we seem as a nation to be willing to proceed in this matter with happy-go-lucky indifference, even to the immediate future. It is this attitude which permits the self-interest of a very few persons to weigh far more than the ultimate interest of all of our people. There are persons who find it to their immense pecuniary benefit to destroy the forest by lumbering. They are to be blamed for thus sacrificing the future of the nation as a whole to their own self-interest of the moment. But heavier blame attaches to the people at large for permitting such action, whether in the White Mountains, in the southern Alleghanies, the Rockies, or the Sierras. Of course, to check the waste of timber means that there must be, on the part of the public, the acceptance of a temporary restriction in the lavish use of timber, in order to prevent the total loss of this use in the future. There are plenty of men in public and private life who actually advocate the continuance of the present system of unchecked and wasteful extravagance, using as an argument the fact that to check it will, of course, mean interference with the ease and comfort of certain people who now get lumber at less cost than they ought to pay, at the expense of the future generations. Some of these people actually demand that the present forest reserves be thrown open to destruction because, forsooth, they think that thereby the price of lumber could be put down again for 2 or 3 more years. Their attitude is precisely like that of an agitator protesting against the outlay of money by farmers on manure and in taking care of their farms generally. Undoubtedly, if the average farmer were content absolutely to ruin his farm, he could, for 2 or 3 years, avoid spending any money on it, yet make a good deal of money out of it. But only a savage would, in his private affairs, show such reckless disregard of the future. Yet it is precisely this reckless disregard of the future which the opponents of the forestry system are now endeavoring to get the people of the United States to show. The only trouble with the movement for the preservation of our forests is that it has not gone nearly far enough, and was not begun soon enough. It is a most fortunate thing, however, that we began it when we did. We should acquire in the Appalachians and the White Mountains regions all the forested lands that is possible to acquire for the use of the nation. These lands, because they form a national asset, are emphatically national. as emphatically national as the rivers which they feed, and which flow through so many states before they reach the ocean.